Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Module 3, Artifact 2. The only job we've got to do today is look at the work of Giotto. Most artists borrow more than innovate, and that's why the progression of the art world sometimes can be slow because there's a tradition that people are working through, and it takes a special kind of artist to invent new things. It's not how art classes are taught, right? Go draw the hallway, learn perspective rather than invent a new perspectival system. We teach you things that have already been done before. But some artists, and Giotto is one of them, see the world through a different kind of eyes. And I don't think it's overstatement to say the following. The art that happened after Giotto was just fundamentally different. He rejected the Italo-Byzantine style that was very much the mode of his teachers, and he developed a different way of seeing the world, a more human way of seeing the world. And the art that followed him in the 14th century, and then of course into the 15th century, is indebted in many ways towards him. What you're looking at on the left-hand side is a sculpture of him that's outside the Uffizi, and then a crucifix that he painted for the church. Well, it's in Santa Maria Novella. I don't know if it was originally for that church or not. In a little while, we'll look at a painting in Santa Maria Novella. Let me see if I can find an exterior picture of the building though, because the outside is just fabulous. There we go. So this is the outside of Santa Maria Novella. And this is a famous painting that's inside Santa Maria Novella, and we are going to look at that in just a little while. But for the time being, know that the church that the church that we're looking at early, or the crucifix that we're looking at, is very much in this church. And let me show you what it looks like in situ because it's pretty fantastic. There it is. It's 19 feet tall and 13 and a half feet across. And I'm not sure exactly, but 19 feet tall is three of me and part of my youngest son tall. It hangs from this ceiling and it's 13 feet across. Now, if we were to compare this crucifix with one done, just 10 years beforehand by Giotto's teacher, we can think about the ways in which Giotto is just different. And to give you an idea in terms of age, Giotto's about 28 years old when he paints this. So he's sort of reaching his artistic maturity, I suppose. How are they different? Because they're similar in some ways, right? They're cross-shaped with sort of little elements here, and you get the idea that Giotto was looking at this when he made this. But the rendering of the body is more realistic. There's a greater interest of volume and three-dimensionality. The fascination that the earlier artists like Cimabue have in pattern has been erased with a greater sense of naturalism. I mean, like, I don't think I want that abdominal wall. That sort of scares me. And this looks a little bit more realistic. This is what a human body looks like. And this is an older representation that has more to do with tradition than what Cimabue actually saw. And maybe that's the smartest way I can put that is Cimabue is working within an artistic tradition that is stronger than his desire to paint exactly what he saw. Giotto is breaking with that tradition, which is why his Jesus looks so different, looks so naturalistic, and he will carry this on in the art of the Arena Chapel as well. I don't have it to show you today, but one of the really cool things about this is this church in Florence. I took a picture of the backside of it recently, and it's just a big, gigantic hunk of wood, and with the armature and the framing of it. So I think that's really, really cool. Masaccio's painting that we'll look at in a little while, Holy Trinity, is over here. And in the back of this is a series of frescoes by an art maker named Gerling Dio. You don't have to learn how to spell it because I never have. Gerling Dio, and he's most famous today for having been one of Michelangelo's teachers. And so this whole thing is filled with frescoes from the ceiling to the floor, and in other spots around the church there are fresco paintings as well. So let's talk about fresco paintings, and we will do so by looking at this church here. This is called the Arena Chapel. It was consecrated and decorated in 1305 in Padua, and Padua is in the northern part of Italy, and I wonder if it's even on my map. Let's see if I got it. Well, it's going to be small. Padua. It's up there. It is. So Padua is up there in the northern part of Italy. Nearby, this was a small amphitheater. And another word for an amphitheater is an arena, so it takes its name from that structure nearby. And Giotto completed an entire series of paintings on the inside of this, and I'll show these to you quickly and come back in a second. So these are the walls, the ceiling vault, the back end, and then the Last Judgment. We've looked at this before when we explored Justinian and Theodora in the San Vitale in Ravenna. So we're going to come back and do a little bit more work, but first I want to talk about frescoes, because from the year around 1300 until, well, golly, 1550, we have a lot of frescoes. And so in order to really understand the paintings, we need to talk about how they're made. Simply put, a fresco painting is painting on a plaster wall. But there are two ways to do a fresco painting. Fresco buono, the true fresco, or fresco a secco, painting on dry plaster. So the first painting on wet plaster, the second painting on dry plaster. Fresco buono, good, true, wet plaster. Fresco a secco, dry plaster. Secco, from the Latin word secco, we get the word desiccate, which means to dry out. So you can paint on a dry plaster wall. My house is filled with plaster walls that have been painted upon. When you do that, you're essentially, let me think about that. Painting on a dry plaster wall is kind of like taking a magic marker and making a tattoo on your lower back with it, right? So I've always wanted, oh goodness, I've always wanted a tattoo on my lower back, and I'm thinking what it would be. Oh, maybe like a nice pair of angel wings, right? I've always wanted this. But the first thing I'm going to do before I'm really to make the big plunge is I'm going to have someone draw it in a black Sharpie. And this way, I can really make sure it's the design I want and the location I want. And black Sharpie is a permanent marker, but when using black Sharpie on skin, it sort of stains the skin, but it's not permanent forever. And so let's say I do that for a while, and I'm convinced, absolutely, that's a really good decision, Brian. I want angel wings on my lower back, and I've done the temporary version, and now it's time for the big version. I'm going to have it tattooed. When I get a tattoo, essentially what I'm doing is I'm injecting ink into the stratum basale of my epidermis. The ink isn't on the skin like it is with a magic marker. It's now in the skin, which means 5 years from now, or better yet, 5 days from now, when I realize getting a tattoo of angel wings on my lower back was a colossally bad idea, I can get a green scrubby and scrub that thing until kingdom come, and it's not going away. A magic marker, because it's on top of the skin, essentially, all I got to do is wait for the skin to grow out, right? I mean, my skin is shedding all the time. The difference between magic marker and tattoo ink is the difference between fresco a secco and fresco buono. When I'm painting with a dry plaster technique, I'm essentially putting pigment on top of the plaster. And it will last a good long while, I suppose. It will last until the plaster comes off the wall or the paint flicks off the wall, as paint does over time. but it will look fine during the meantime, but it's not permanent. But the wet plaster technique involves painting on wet plaster. And when I do that, the pigment isn't on the wall. The pigment becomes part of the wall. And that means that painting will be there as long as the wall is. Fresco buono. And the reason this happens is that, excuse me, is that fresco paint is made of two parts, just like tempera paint was. Tempera was pigment and egg white. Fresco paint is pigment and lime water. Lime water. Plaster also made with lime. And so because of this, when the lime water paint is placed upon the wet plaster, that pigment becomes chemically bound to it. It's not on the wall. It is quite literally in the wall. It has been tattooed into the wall. I'll show you some fresco paintings today that are 700 years old. They've been cleaned and they look fabulous. And honestly, they can be cleaned really easily. I mean, like, because the pigment, the dirt, is on the wall, not in the wall. You just have to wash the dirt off. It's not quite that simple, but it is really doable. And so let's talk about this diagram because it will allow us to understand some of the cool things that are happening. You might see this thing here. A is the wall, right? Walls are made of brick. And we're going to put first down a layer of plaster. It's called oricio in Italian. So we're going to build a wall, cover it with plaster. And then on any given day, I'm going to have a kind of line diagram. So I have a wall, and on my wall, I want to paint a team portrait of the Ruston High basketball team. Always wanted that on my wall. So I'm gonna get I'm gonna draw the Ruston basketball team on the wall in what you and I would call a pencil, right? It's gonna be really, really light. What I'm then going to do on Monday is I'm gonna paint the first two people in the lower left. I'm going to create a large scale cartoon. A cartoon is a fancy word for large preparatory drawing. So I'm going to put up this big sheet of paper over Bobby and Jimmy, and I'm going to poke holes over the outlines. The outlines on that plaster wall, I had to put that on the wall so I know scale and whatnot. But now I'm going to put this big sheet of paper on there. I'm going to like tape it up, and I'm going to poke little holes through the line so that I've got kind of a tracing of it. And now where Jimmy and I forgot who it was, Jimmy and Bobby, where Jimmy and Bobby are going to go, I'm now going to apply a fresh coat of wet plaster. Whatever I plaster today, that's what I paint today. And that is called a giornata. So today I'm going to paint this. Giornata essentially is Italian for day's work. Like buongiorno, Giorno, buongiorno, and nata, day work. So this is what I'm going to paint today. I now have that preparatory drawing, don't I? With all the holes in it, remember? And I put that up on the wet plaster, and I've got a kind of bean bag. And in that bean bag is, let's just call it graphite dust. And I pounce it. I push it all over those dots so that that graphite comes through the holes onto the wet plaster. And I then can do a very quick incision with the back of my almost a toothbrush, paintbrush, right? I flip my paintbrush over and I sort of outline those major lines so I know where Jimmy starts and where Bobby ends or whatever. And now on Tuesday, I'm painting Bobby and Jimmy while that plaster is still wet. And what's fascinating about this is when you look at frescoes up close, you can see where Monday starts and Tuesday begins. And part of the reason for this involves one of the advantages, or I guess I should say disadvantages, of working with fresco. So drink of coffee. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of working with fresco. One of the great advantages of working with fresco is you can make a painting big. And I don't mean big, I mean big, big, huge, enormous, as big as a wall. The Sistine Chapel is 2.5 times the size of my house. One painting, 2.5 size of my house. That's enormous. So in fresco painting, you can make a painting as big as you can make a wall. I'll show you a big painting, a big tempera painting. There's a big tempera painting. It's 9 feet tall. I can only make it 9 feet tall because I can only make it as big as I can make my support. And if I make a wooden support too big, it warps and bends and does all of that. But if I want to do a fresco, I can make that 20 feet tall and 50 feet long. Doesn't matter. However big my wall is, I can make my painting. So that's an advantage. Another advantage is when done correctly with the true fresco method, you can make that painting permanent. And I mean permanent as the bad idea tattoo I have on my lower back. It will be there as long as you take care of that wall. I mean, the Arena Chapel's from 1305. Let me do the math. That's 700 and some years old now. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel was painted in 1508 to 1512. Really, really old. Oil paintings require a bit more love. Fresco paintings, all you have to do is not abuse them. So they're remarkably durable. But there are some disadvantages to this as well. Because on Monday, I'm going to paint this here, I'm working relatively quickly. And because I'm working relatively quickly, there's not going to be a great amount of detail in the things I'm painting. It also has something to do with the inherent slushiness of fresco paint. I've never actually messed with watercolors aside from like elementary school, but people who do watercolors will talk about what a difficult process it is to control because your paint is water. Fresco is sort of like that. And so you can't have a lot of details with watercolors, and the same is true of fresco. Part of that's because of the media, and part of that is because of the speed at which an art maker is working. Another disadvantage of fresco painting involves the use of color. Now, if I were playing around with oil paint or acrylic paint, I can make a kaleidoscope of hues and values within them, right? If I have red, blue, and yellow, and white and black, I can kind of do a lot of different stuff, right? With only 5 different pigments, right? Because if I have green and yellow, I can make green. If I have green and white, I can make light green. If I have green and gray, I can desaturate that green. Like with just 5 tubes of paint, I can do lots of crazy stuff with oil paint. But the same is not true with fresco paint. For every color and for every value, I have to mix that paint separately. So this means if I want to have green, I can have green, light green, and dark green. But I can't have shamrock green and pine green and Kelly green and British racing green and grass green and seafoam green, right? Because I'm not going to mix all of those. I'll have green, light green, and dark green. And I don't make green by mixing blue and yellow together. Mixing blue and yellow fresco paint together doesn't get you green, it gets you a mess. And so we're limited in regards to the colors that we have when it comes to fresco paint. And the colors themselves look inherently chalky or somewhat like they're pastels. Bright fresco paints are a real challenge. You can get a bit of it when looking at the ceiling vault here, but that's because of the extravagant pigment that they're using, which is ground up lapis lazuli. It's really, really amazing. So really quickly, let me show you a diagram of the Arena Chapel, and not because it's going to come back to us, but just because I want you to know about the complicated series of paintings that Giotto completed for a private patron. The first thing we have is a series of paintings of the life of Joachim. Then we have the life of the Virgin, And then we have a series of paintings about the life of Christ and everything from the visitation to the nativity towards the crucifixion. I mean, even things like Pentecost and the Last Judgment. So it is quite literally from the beginning, like just before the Annunciation, all the way to Christ coming again to judge the living and the dead, right? So crucifixion, deposition, the ascension into heaven, all of that are shown here. And I want to show you, we're just going to focus on a nice little segment here. And one painting in particular, although I'll show you many, and the painting I want to show you is the one right here. This is called the Lamentation. The Lamentation. And the word lament a little bit. Lament means like I lament the fact that I won't get to see my kids very much today, right? Because I'm at work and it's summertime and they're hanging out. So to lament something is to feel sad. And certainly there's lamentation happening here. And I'll show you some details in but a moment. But this is one segment of the wall, and here are the narratives that are present here, including both the lamentation, and here is what's called the Nolo Me Tenge, which literally means don't touch me. And I'll show you that detail in a second. Okay, here we go. Here's our lamentation. There are things present here that are so amazing and surprising, and you take so much for granted that you don't understand how amazing and surprising they are just yet. And I'll point out some of these things. To begin with, this is a landscape in some way, right? Like in some way, it is a landscape painting. And there's a variety of ways in which art makers can create a sense of depth in a flat painting. And one of those involves overlapping and the other involves foreshortening, both of which Giotto uses to remarkably good effect. So, for example, this figure in the foreground is wearing his green cloak. He is in front of Jesus, who is in front of Mary, who's in front of this Mary Magdalene, who's in front of this character, who's in front of that character, who is in front of this blue background. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-ish, and background. So we know right away that we have a certain amount of distance between our first line here and that figure there. These bodies seem to be real. They seem to have volume and form about them. And the other really interesting thing here is about the use of foreshortening. So let me jump ahead. This is St. John the Beloved. We'll see a bunch of him during our fun together. Here's John's head. Here's one of his hands here. And there's his other hand. There it is. And I ask you, when you look at this, do you think his hand is growing out of his shoulder? And the answer is no. You know exactly what John's doing because you're a smart visual learner. You realize that he has his arm raised back, and there is a distance between this shoulder and that hand that involves all of his humerus, all of his radius and ulna, and then some wrist bones too. And that is the distance between here and there, the base of his wrist, is the distance of his entire arm. That what Giotto has done is foreshortened all of that. Giotto didn't invent foreshortening, right? Foreshortening's been around as long as there's been art makers and bodies. But he is someone who cared enough about it to bring it back so as to create a sense of volume within this composition. When we look at Mary Magdalene here, you can see the ways in which color works for fresco painting. You get 3 values, not 100. And when you look at her hair, you can see the lack of detail there. If I can zip ahead here, and whenever I zip ahead, I always get a little frazzled because I'm not super good at doing things on the fly. But let me see if I can find a depiction of some oil hair. You ready? How about this? This is a depiction of Adam. How's Eve doing? Eve, ooh, let's do it Eve better. We'll come back to Jan van Eyck and a couple of artifacts now. But you see that? That, my friends, is oil hair. That is a strand of oil hair. As I recall, Adam's got a gray whisker, which I loved. Oh, it's in there somewhere. It's like a single gray whisker. That's not what happens with fresco paint. In fresco paint, we get this kind of hair, right? I often describe it as a difference between a real beard and a Santa Claus beard. Like Santa Claus beards, which are made out of like cotton fluff or whatever, doesn't look like a real beard. When you see a real Santa with a real beard, you know a real beard. Fake beards don't really look like real beards. That's a Santa Claus beard. Now, there's some interesting things going on here that you might not have noticed at first. Do you see that white edge there? That white edge is a lip, right? It projects out from the wall. I never knew this until I went to Padua and saw these objects. Then I bought like a $200 book with great pictures of it. This halo, all these halos, project out from the wall. They're three-dimensional. Like, look at that. These things come out. They're also rippled. They're kind of like ruffles. Ruffles have ridges? Is that the potato chip? They have a sense of volume about them. The plaster comes out into our space. There's something else going on here. Look at her. She's sad, sad, sad. Giotto has captured a sense of emotion here that was kind of unknown in the medieval world, and even in some of the proto-Renaissance too. Like there is a sincere sense of sorrow about these figures. I mean, the color is slightly off on this image. So let's give you an idea. One image, another image. But look at these angels. They're weeping, they're wailing, they're tearing their hair from their heads. We see this interest in the human when we get to the Renaissance that wasn't really there before. Like the human condition was not really a part of the medieval world. It was all about God. And in the Renaissance, and we'll speak more about this when we move forward a little bit, the Renaissance was very much about this return to the humanism of the classical past. I mean, art makers in the Renaissance are not only interested in the art that was made during that time frame, but they're also interested in the intellectual developments of the Renaissance, the philosophy, the theology, the interest in humanity that was not necessarily part of the medieval world. All right, I call your attention to these lines here. Do you see that? Those are the giornata, right? This is Monday. What's Giotto going to do? He's going to paint two angels and he's going to have a snack. Day is done. And when you look at these objects, you can make out these things because no matter how hard you try, you're mixing blue paint tomorrow. The blue you make on Monday is never going to be identical to the blue you make on Tuesday. Moreover, those giornata often have been incised with lines from the back of a paintbrush. And so we can make these things out. As a result, we can almost see how these art makers worked on these. In the summer of 2019, when I was running through the Vatican Museum, I ended up in the room called the Stanza della Signatoria. It's a room in the papal apartments in the Vatican, and Raphael painted a super famous work there called the School of Athens. He also painted another one called the Disputa, and they're really, really great paintings. This is what the room looks like when there's no people in there, and needless to say, there were a bunch of people there. But when looking at these paintings, you can see those incisions. You can see like those the lines in the paintings on the wall. It's actually really cool, and I've seen them before, but I was just struck with them in particular during this most recent visit. So I want to show you some more pictures from the Arena Chapel, and then we'll segue into the Last Judgment. So this is Joachim in the wilderness and the meeting at the Golden Gate. And there's something at play here that I think is important to point out, and that is Giotto, although he is doing some new things, he is not completely revolutionizing the art world. For example, the construction of space is better, but not great. You give me another artifact, I'll show you great. For example, the perspective of this architectural structure does not match up, but that's okay. It's not the goal of Giotto to accurately render three-dimensional objects. This is the kiss of Judas, and this is the raising of Lazarus, both images from the life of Christ. And I call your attention to this right here. Like, this is Judas kissing Christ. This is St. Peter, and it's kind of hard to make out there. You know what? Forgive me for something real quick. Let me make this bigger. There's St. Peter. See what Peter's doing there? Peter, he's got a good halo. Peter is going to wear a lot of orange and blue. It's his uniform. It's like he went to Florida or Clemson or something. And look at that. Peter's got a knife, and Peter is going gangsta on this guy. And it's kind of hard to make it out, but Peter is cutting off his ear. There's his ear. It's kind of falling down. We'll come back to that in due time. Give me a little bit. My friends, we'd already looked at the Last Judgment, but we had done so under the broad umbrella of Justinian and Theodora. So I want to go through some stuff pretty quickly, and just let you see some of the beautiful frescoes and some of the ways in which people conceived of hell 700 years ago. And then, if you ask really nicely, I'll read you some Italian poetry, but you gotta ask nicely. So this is the whole thing. Christ in majesty, on his right side, the good people, on his left, the bad side, up top, angels and saints, the pearly gates, honestly, being peeled aside. And this painting is just so fantastic that I wanted to show it to you. So Jesus is clearly having a very good Wednesday because he's sitting inside a gigantic rainbow. And at the top of it, the angels are peeling back the blue sky to reveal the pearly gates. So heaven is here. Good people, they have halos. There's St. Peter. I like St. Peter. I mean, I like all saints, but I like him. Santa Claus beard. Good people. Again, all standing on the good side of Christ. Some of them with their hands raised in the universal sign of prayer. The people who are wearing crown are probably saints, or they've been martyred. Not everyone martyred is saints. And then we get to the other side, and things become a little bit more scary. So this is your reason to be a good person, because there are these blue devilly guys and pitchforky dudes and all kinds of unpleasant stuff happening. So get ready in art history class. You're going to see some scary stuff. So here's Lucifer. Lucifer is grabbing that dude and eating that dude, and this going to this guy and defecating that guy. So that's not good to be any of those people, all things considered. Nor is it good to be hung from your tongue, hung from your hair, or hung from your testicle or penis. Also, not good things. Like, this is a reminder of all the things you ought not to do, so you can end up on this side rather than that side. Like, this is sort of terrifying. And when we spoke about this object, I spoke to you about the reason why it was made. So the person who commissioned this was a man named Enrico Scrovengi. And he was from a wealthy Paduan family. And all things considered, he was a little bit worried about his dad because his dad was a money lender. Now, if you think the interest you paid for your credit card when you get one is bad, you've got nothing on the money lenders in the Italian Renaissance, because they were vicious. If you missed your minimum monthly payment, they owned you, your dog, your sister, your house, and tomorrow's lunch. It was absolutely ridiculous. And so there is an Italian poet by the name of Dante, and Dante's most famous work is a 3-volume poem which is traditionally called the Divine Comedy. And comedy in this instance doesn't mean like, haha, funny. It's like story. And so in Italian, it's commedia. And so when people speak of the commedia, they mean one of 3 parts. The first is inferno, hell. The second is purgatory, which is this kind of Catholic construction of a place where those who are going to go to heaven atone for their sins before they get to go to heaven. And the last one is paradise. Now, I've read all of them. Actually, I've read all of them a couple times, but the most interesting one is hell, because in it, Dante, to use a 21st century phrase, he throws people under the bus. Were you a bad person? Dante puts you in hell, which I think is really, really funny. And so I want to read you a little bit of the Divine Comedy to talk about why this guy's dad decided it would be a really good idea to spend a lot of money and build this here church. Because this here church is not cheap, it costs money. So here we are. So we are in the seventh layer of hell. There are 9 of them. Hell gets worse as you go down. The sins become worse, and the punishment for those sins become more dire. And so he's in the seventh circle of hell, and it's the circle for violence. And violence takes on many different forms. I need my reading glasses. Getting old is not for the weak of heart, my friends. Okay. Thus, on the seventh circle's edge, still farther out, I went alone to where the downcast souls were seated. Their grief came bursting from their eyes. With restless hands they sought relief now from the flame and now from burning sand. Not otherwise do dogs in summer gnaw and scratch, now with muzzle, now with paw, with flies or fleas or horseflies bite them. So these people are scratching themselves just like dogs do when they're bitten by fleas. So that's their punishment. They're scratching themselves endlessly. Although I searched some of the faces of those on whom the painful fire descends, I knew not one of them, but I could see the pouches hanging on their necks were different colors, each with its coat of arms. So Dante writes, I looked at their faces, but I couldn't recognize them. The only thing I saw was their money purses, and on their money purses were their family seals. On these, those money purses, they seemed to feast their eyes. And when I came among them and looked closer, on a yellow purse I could make out a lion's countenance and blue in form. So it was a blue lion. It was the face of a blue lion, and that's the family seal of the Gianfigolazzi family. Then, further on, my wandering gaze made out another crest, blood red, marked by a goose more white than butter. So a red seal with a white swan on it, and that's the Oriaci family. And one who had a pregnant sow in azure embossed on his white wallet and said to me, What are you doing in this ditch? The sow in azure, that's blue. So on a white wallet, a blue cow, and that is Reginaldo della Scrovegni, this guy right here. And he said to me, What are you doing in this ditch? Get out of here. Wait, since you're still alive, know that my neighbor, Vitiliano, shall soon be seated on my left. Among these Florentines, I come from Padua. Many a time they deafen me with shouting, May the sovereign knight come soon, who brings the pouch with 3 goats on it. That's another Florentine leader. So, what happens? Like, this is hysterical. I love this. Art history is awesome. Poor Enrico Scrovegni. He's living his own happy life, and he's a rich guy because his father was a money lender, which essentially means he was guilty of the sin of usury or charging interest. And because Dante doesn't like a bunch of people, he decides to put him in a layer of hell, and a bad one. And in the Divine Comedy, Dante essentially takes a field trip to hell with Virgil, who is a Roman poet who wrote the Aeneid. Remember way back when, the Augustus of Prima Porta, which was sort of based on Virgil's Aeneid. So the classical poet Virgil is taking Dante into hell. And Dante identifies Enrico Scrovegni's father there in the 7th layer of hell, and as a way to help atone for his father's sins. Enrico Scrovegni pays for this chapel, And here shows his father holding up a model of the church to the Virgin Mary, as if to say, sorry, our bad. Don't mess with the poets. What Giotto does in the Orient Chapel fundamentally changes, like the art world. Suddenly, the interest in space, overlapping, foreshortening becomes an interest in the art world, right? Here is his Maestà, dates from 1310. So the Arena Chapel, 1305, this 5 years later. And this was a Maestà from just 30 years beforehand. And think about how different this object looks in some ways, right? I don't mean to suggest you it's totally different. Still got gold leaf, still have overlapping of bodies in a cramped space. But now look at Mary's lap. Look at the volume there. Look at the humanity in these figures. Suddenly, Giotto is doing something no one had done before. And as the 14th century moves onward, we see a lot more Giottos, a lot more followers of Giotto, the something new, than the people who are working through the tradition of, of the Byzantine world. And so that therein lies Giotto's importance. When we come back next time, my friends, we are going to look at the art and architecture of the early Renaissance in Florence, and we're going to spend some time looking at this city, my favorite city, and this building, and this my favorite building, um, and that will be part of artifact number 4. I beg your pardon, artifact number 3. Don't let me get ahead of myself. So many thanks for your kind attention. Have a great day.